She came off the noon freight wagon into a wind that smelled of dust and dead clover, carrying nothing but a bound hamper and a stillness the men loafing outside the mercantile mistook for defeat. It was not defeat. Cordelia Vane had buried more than most of them would ever own, had walked away from a life that had promised her comfort and given her nothing but a fine name and an empty purse, and she had not ridden 400 miles across the flat brown middle of the country to stand in the ruts of a town she had never heard of, and be afraid of a little weather or a few staring men. Reuben Hollis had written away for a wife the same way another man writes away for a load of seed corn, because the work of the place had grown larger than one grieving set of hands could hold, and because the house had gone so quiet since the diphtheria took Margaret that a man could sit at a table set for one only so many evenings before the silence started to feel like a thing with weight. He wanted someone plain and steady. He wanted someone who would keep his kitchen and mind his dead wife's bee gums out behind the willows, and otherwise leave his grief where he had buried it. He expected to be disappointed, the way he had come to expect disappointment of the weather, the bank, and most of the promises the prairie had ever made him. What Reuben Hollis did not know, standing there at the edge of the loading dock with his hat crushed in both fists and his farm sliding one bad season at a time toward the ledger of the Millard's Ford Bank, was that the quiet woman climbing down over the wagon wheel had grown up with her hands in honeycomb, that she could read a hive the way a preacher reads scripture, and that the very thing this whole town had already written off as dead and cursed and worthless would, before the first hard freeze, become the only cash money moving through the valley. If this story speaks to you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. It was the last week of September in the year 1883 in the sandhill country north of the little town of Millard's Ford, Nebraska, and the plum thickets along the draws had already gone red at the edges. The freighter who had carried her the last 22 miles from the railhead did not help her down. He was a broad, sun-cured man who had said perhaps 40 words the whole way, and he set her hamper in the dirt beside the mercantile steps, touched his hat brim, and clucked his team on toward the livery without once looking to see whether anyone had come to claim her. For a long moment Cordelia stood alone in the middle of the only street the town had, and the town looked back at her. Millard's Ford was not much. A mercantile with a sagging porch, a land office and a bank sharing one squat brick building, the only brick in sight, a church that needed paint, a blacksmith, a saloon with its shutters half off the hinges, and a scatter of frame houses gone the same silver gray the whole plains turned when the sun and wind were finished with a thing. Beyond the last building the land simply opened and ran, low green gold hills folding away toward a horizon so far off it seemed to belong to a different and larger world. She had read about the sand hills in the pamphlet the marriage broker had pressed on her, all of it printed in the hopeful, lying language such pamphlets used, and she had known even then that the truth would be harder and plainer than the words. It was. She found she did not mind. Hard and plain she could work with. It was soft and false that had ruined her. A woman came out onto the mercantile porch, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked Cordelia over with the frank, measuring, not unkind curiosity of a person who has watched a great many hopeful strangers arrive in a place that eats hope for breakfast. "You'll be the one Reuben sent for," the woman said. It was not a question. "I am. He's late then. Or he isn't coming. With Reuben Hollis, a body never knows which." The woman said it flatly, without malice, the way she might have remarked that it looked like rain. "You can wait inside where it's out of the wind, if you've a mind to." "I'm Prudence Galt," My husband keeps the store." Cordelia thanked her and did not go inside. She stood by her hamper in the wind with her back straight and her gloved hands folded, and she waited. Because she had learned in the last 2 hard years that a woman who let a town see her flinch would be flinching for the rest of her days in it, and she did not intend to spend the rest of her days flinching. She waited an hour. She watched the light go long in gold across the ruts. She watched a boy drive a milk cow down the street and 3 riders come in dusty off the flats and tie up at the saloon, and she felt the town watching her the whole while, from behind curtains and over ledgers and out of the corners of squinted eyes, the way a small place will watch a thing it has not decided about yet. And then, near the end of that hour, a wagon came up out of the south draw drawn by a single tired bay, and the man driving it was not in any hurry, and she knew before he had covered half the distance that this was the man she had crossed the country to marry. Reuben Hollis was perhaps 35, though the weather and the grief had put a decade on his face that the calendar had not yet earned. He was tall and gone lean past the point of health, with a dark beard shot early with gray and a pair of gray eyes that had the flat, guarded, walled-off look of a man who had decided somewhere back down the road that wanting things was a mistake he did not care to make twice. He drew the bay up before the mercantile, set the brake, and sat a moment looking down at her from the wagon seat, and she looked back up at him, and neither of them said anything for the length of several breaths. She did not smile at him. She had thought, on the train, that she ought to smile when she met him, that a smile was the currency a woman was expected to arrive with. But looking up at that closed gray face, she understood that a smile would be a lie between them, and she had come here precisely to be done with lies, and so she gave him instead the truth, which was a level, unafraid, considering look. Something in his face shifted, very slightly, as though he had braced for one thing and been handed another. "Miss Vane," he said. His voice was low and rusted from disuse. "Mr. Hollis, you'll have been waiting. An hour, near enough. The pump chain broke. I've no money for a new one, so I mended the old, and mending takes longer than buying." He said it plainly, without apology and without excuse, simply as the fact of why he was late, and she understood 2 things at once from it. That he was a man who told the truth even when the truth was poverty, and that he had told her the size of his poverty inside the first minute, rather than let her discover it and think he had hidden it. It was, she thought, the first thing about him she liked, though she would not have called it liking yet. "Then I'm glad you got here at all," she said. He climbed down, and he did not take her hand, but he lifted her hamper into the wagon bed with a care that surprised her, settling it against the sideboard where it would not shift. And he handed her up onto the seat with a brief, formal touch of his fingers to her elbow, and that was the whole of their courtship. There had been a paper signed by proxy and a promise made through a broker's letters, and there would be a few words spoken before the paint-hungry church comes Sunday to make it lawful in the eyes of the town. But the marrying, the true and private marrying, was this: a tired man and a quiet woman on a wagon seat, riding out of a gray town into the last of the gold light, neither of them expecting to be saved by the other, both of them too worn to hope for anything past getting through the winter. They rode south. The town fell behind, and the land took them in. Cordelia had never seen country like it, the long grass-covered dunes rolling away in every direction, green, gold, and treeless save where the draws held their thin lines of willow and plum and chokecherry, and the sky enormous over all of it, a sky that made a person feel very small and, oddly, not unwelcome. Reuben did not speak. He drove with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the road, and she let the silence be, because she had learned that a silence a person does not rush to fill will often tell you more about them than any amount of talk. After a time, without turning his head, he said, "It's not what the paper made it sound." "No," she said. "I didn't expect it would be. The place is poorly. I'll not lie to you about it, since you'll see it inside the hour anyway. There's a mortgage on it held by the bank in the Ford, and the note comes due in the spring, and I do not, as of this evening, have the money to meet it." He said it staring straight ahead, his jaw tight, and she understood what it had cost him to say it. This proud, closed, beaten man, to a stranger he had bought a wife's passage for on the last of his credit. "How much is owed?" she asked. He glanced at her sidelong, as if the question surprised him, as if he had expected her to weep or to demand he turn the wagon around and take her back to the train. $640, he said. "Due the 1st of April. All of it. Principal and the interest they've larded onto it. I've maybe a third of it, if the fall calves bring what they ought, which they won't, because everything else this year has come in low. $640. It was, to a farmer in the Sandhills in the year 1883, very near an impossible sum, a whole prosperous year's clear profit in a place that had not had a prosperous year in living memory. Cordelia turned it over in her mind the way she turned over any hard figure, not with despair, but with the cold, steady attention of a person who has learned that a number, however large, is only a number, and that numbers are met by other numbers, dollar upon dollar, and not by wringing of hands. "What have you got to sell?" she asked. 60 head of cattle, poor and thin, a quarter section of grass and another quarter leased, a team, a milk cow, some hogs, and Margaret's bees. He said the last two words differently from all the rest, more quietly, and she marked it. "Margaret was your wife." She was, and the bees were hers. She kept them. 14 gums back of the willows on the home draw. She had a hand for them nobody else ever did. Since she passed, they've dwindled and turned mean, and the last 2 summers I got hardly a comb of honey out of the lot, and the man at the store says they're likely finished, that a hive goes with the person that keeps it sometimes, and the whole valley's decided the Hollis bees are dead or cursed, or both. He said it bitterly, and she understood that the bees were not to him a matter of honey and money at all, but a matter of Margaret, a last living thing his dead wife had loved that was dying now under his clumsy, grieving hands, and that every failed summer of them was one more small proof to Reuben Hollis that he could not keep alive the things that were given to him. "I'd like to see them," Cordelia said. He looked at her again, longer this time. "You know bees?" "I was raised among them," she said, and she left it at that, because the whole of that truth was longer than a wagon ride, and she was not ready to give it to him yet. But she had spoken it plainly, and it was the truth, and he heard the truth in it, and he did not laugh at her or wave it off the way the men outside the mercantile would have. He only nodded once and put his eyes back on the road, and something in the set of his shoulders eased by a fraction that she would not have caught if she had not been watching for it. The sun was near the horizon when they came up the home draw, and she saw the place that was to be her life. It was worse than the town, and better than she had feared. A low, soddy-fronted frame house, half sod and half board, its yard bare and swept, a barn leaning tiredly to the east, a pole corral, a windmill turning slow and creaking against the gold sky, and away behind the house, in the shelter of a stand of old gnarled willows along the seep where the draw held its water, a ragged row of gray, weathered bee gums, hollow log hives and rough box hives both standing crooked in the long grass like a row of forgotten graves. She looked at them a long time from the wagon seat while Reuben unhitched the bay. Even from that distance, in the failing light, she could read the trouble in them. Two of the gums stood dead silent, no bees working the entrances at all, robbed out and abandoned. Several more had that thin, listless, disheartened traffic at the mouth that means a colony gone queenless or starving or riddled with the moth. But two of them, the two nearest the willows where the evening shade fell longest, still had a strong, purposeful, homing stream of foragers pouring in heavy laden against the last of the light. And Cordelia Vane, watching those two hives work, felt the first thing she had felt in a long time that was not simply the grim resolve of a woman getting through her days. She felt the small, particular, private gladness of a person who has come a very long way and found, against all expectation, one thing she knows how to save. The inside of the house told her the rest of what she needed to know about the man she had married. It was scrupulously clean, which surprised her, swept and ordered in the particular bleak fashion of a man who keeps a house tidy the way a soldier keeps a fort, out of discipline rather than comfort. But it was a house half emptied. There were nails on the walls where framed things had hung and been taken down. There was a rocker by the stove with a folded shawl over its back that no one had touched, she could see. In a long while the shawl gone stiff, with settled dust in its folds. There was a good iron cookstove and a scoured table, and 2 chairs, only 2, and a narrow bed built into the wall of the front room. And behind a curtain a second room she understood without being told had been Margaret's and Reuben's, and was now no one's, its door standing open on a bare rope bedstead stripped of everything. A room he had emptied and could not bring himself to either use or shut. He had made up the wall bed in the front room for her with clean sheets gone gray from washing and an honest wool blanket, and he would sleep, she gathered, in the barn or on a pallet by the stove, and neither of them said a word about the arrangement because there was nothing to say. The marriage was a contract. They both knew the shape of it. He had bought a pair of working hands and a way to stop the silence rattling the empty house, and she had bought passage out of a life that had become unlivable. And if either of them had come west secretly hoping for something warmer than a contract, they had the good sense and the hard experience not to show it. She cooked their first supper out of what she found in his poorly stocked lean-to pantry. Cornmeal and side pork and a withered onion and coffee boiled thin to make it last, and she made it taste better than the sum of its parts, because that was a thing she knew how to do. And he ate 3 helpings without a word, and then, at the end, staring at his empty plate, said, "That's the best I've eaten since Margaret." He said it and then went very still, as though the name had escaped him against his will, and something crossed his face that she did not look at too closely, because it was the kind of expression that asked for a tenderness she was not yet entitled to give. "I'm glad it suited you," she said, and rose and cleared the plates, and let him have his grief unwatched, and that was the first kindness she did him, though he did not know to call it one. She lay awake a long while that first night in the wall bed, listening to the windmill creak and the strange, enormous silence of the sandhills, a silence with no edges to it, and she thought about the 2 strong hives working against the dusk, and she thought about $640, and somewhere in the small dark hours she made herself a promise of the kind she did not make lightly and had never yet broken. She had come to this bleak, beautiful place with nothing, and she would not leave it with nothing, and more than that, this beaten, honest man who told the truth about his poverty to a stranger would not lose his wife's bees and his wife's land in the same slow, grinding defeat if there was a single thing Cordelia Vane could do to prevent it. She did not yet know how. She only knew that she would. In the morning she was up before him, which was not easy, for he rose in the black cold before dawn as farmers do. And she had the fire going and the coffee on and cornmeal mush thickening on the stove when he came in from the barn, stamping the chill out of his boots. And he stopped in the doorway and looked at the warm-lit kitchen and the woman moving in it. And for just a moment, before he shuttered it, his face was the face of a man who has walked into a room he had thought was empty forever and found it lived in. Then he shuttered it and hung his hat and sat and ate, and they began the first ordinary day of a marriage that neither of them had any reason yet to believe would become a real one. She asked him over that first breakfast to show her the bees. He set down his cup and looked at her the way a man looks at a thing he wants to believe and has been fooled too often to trust. "They've turned mean," he said. "I told you. The 2 live gums'll come out at you the moment you crack the lid." Margaret handled them barehanded, and they never touched her. But they know she's gone, I think, and they've not forgiven the rest of us for it. Cyrus Mead at the store says a hive'll sometimes die of grief same as a dog will, and I've half come to believe it. "A hive doesn't grieve," Cordelia said, gently, because she did not want to shame him. "It fears. A hive that's lost a good keeper isn't mourning. It's been mishandled, or robbed by the dead ones next to it, or gone short of stores, and a frightened, hungry hive stings, because stinging is the only argument it has. Let me look at them and I'll tell you which it is." He took her out to the willows in the flat gold morning light, and he stood well back with his arms crossed while she walked slow among the crooked gray gums, and she did not put on the veil he offered her. And she did not take up the smoker, and she moved among those hives the way some people move among frightened horses, unhurried, low-voiced, giving the air around her nothing to be afraid of. And the bees that had driven Reuben Hollis, stumbling and cursing from his own dead wife's bees, did not so much as light on her. She crouched by the first of the 2 live gums a long while, watching the foragers come and go, reading the color of the pollen on their legs and the heft of them as they landed, and the particular contented pitch of the hum. Then she leaned in, close enough that Reuben made an involuntary sound of warning behind her, and she breathed the smell of the hive, the warm bread and wax and honey smell of a colony that is, against everything the valley believed, entirely and stubbornly alive. She straightened and turned to him, and there was color in her face that had not been there before. "This one's strong," she said, "strong and crowded and about to swarm, which is why she's cross, not grief, crowding. She wants more room, and you've given her none in 2 years. So she's making ready to split herself, and half of them will fly off into the plum thickets and be lost to you by the end of the week if we don't give her room today. The second gum's the same. The dead ones yonder are dead, robbed out. The moths got the comb. We'll burn those. But these 2, Mr. Hollis, these 2 are not cursed, and they are not dying. These 2 are the best 2 colonies I have seen since I left my father's yard. And if you will let me have them and the tools and a free hand, I will make you honey off this draw that this valley has not seen the like of." Reuben Hollis stared at her. He stared at the woman standing bareheaded and unstung among the bees that had chased him, the bees the whole country had buried, and she watched the thing happen in his face that she would come, over the slow months ahead, to live for, though she did not know it yet. She watched a beaten man be handed, from a direction he had stopped watching, one small, unlooked-for reason to hope. "What do you need?" he said. And that, more than any word spoken before any preacher, was the true beginning of the marriage of Reuben Hollis and Cordelia Vane. What she needed, it turned out, was more than Reuben had and less than he feared. She needed lumber, straight-grained pine, To build the hives she meant to build, the kind with movable frames she had seen a bee-man from the east demonstrate at a county fair when she was a girl. Hives a keeper could open and read like a book instead of the old blind log gums a body had to break apart and rob by guess. She needed beeswax, which the hives themselves would give her, and thin wire, and a few tools a blacksmith could beat out cheap. She needed the near quarter of grass left unmown along the draws where the sweet clover and the wild alfalfa and the great drifts of purple bee plant grew. The very weeds Reuben had been half-minded to burn off as useless. And she needed him to trust her with all of it in a season when he could not afford to be wrong. He gave it to her. He had, she would understand later, very little left to lose, and a man with little left to lose will sometimes make a braver wager than a comfortable man ever would, and so Reuben Hollis wagered the last of his lumber money and a corner of his failing farm on the steadiness of a woman he had known 4 days. It was the best bet he ever made, though it would be a long cold while before either of them was sure of it. She built the first 2 frame hives at the workbench in the leaning barn, and he watched her do it, and then, because a farmer cannot bear to watch work being done and stand idle, he took up tools and helped her. And that shared labor in the lamplit barn was the first thing they ever did side by side. She showed him how the frames must hang just so, a bee's width apart and no more. And he, who had a good eye and clever hands gone rusty from doing everything alone and joylessly, caught the trick of it quickly and made better frames than her own by the 3rd one. And when she told him so, he did not smile, quite. But the wall behind his eyes came down a hand's breadth, and he worked a little faster. In the cool of the next dawn, when the 2 live gums were sluggish with the night's chill and least apt to fly, she moved the colonies. It was delicate, dangerous, patient work, cutting the wild calm from the hollow logs and binding it into the new frames with strips of cloth, so the bees could mend it fast to the wood, hunting through the crawling golden mass for the long-bodied queen, and cupping her safe in one bare hand, while 10,000 of her daughters roared confusion around them both. And Reuben stood ready with the smoker she had taught him to use, and watched his dead wife's bees pass through the hands of his new wife into their new homes, and did not once get stung. And something about the whole strange, gentle operation moved him in a way he could not have named and did not try to. By full light it was done. 2 crowded, cross, half-wild colonies stood rehoused in clean, movable frame hives with a full empty story of room above them to grow into, and by noon the swarming fever had passed out of them, and the foragers were pouring out into the bee plant and the late clover as if they had been born to it, and the meanness was simply gone, bled off with the crowding exactly as she had said it would be. Reuben stood looking at the transformed hives a long time. "You said they'd gentle," he said finally. And they gentled. They only wanted room and a steady hand. Most cross things do. She said it lightly. But he looked at her when she said it, and neither of them pretended he had not heard the second meaning under the first. From that morning, the work took on a shape and a rhythm. Cordelia rose before dawn to her kitchen and her hens and the milk cow, and by the long light of the forenoon she was out among the willows with her hives, and she spent the shortening autumn days doing what she had crossed a country to have the chance to do again, which was to coax 2 strong colonies toward the strongest fall harvest they could give. It was late in the year for it, she knew, and much of what she did that first autumn was not for that season's honey, which would be small, but for the season to come, building the colonies strong and heavy with winter stores, splitting nothing, taking little, feeding when the flow ran thin, so that come the spring these 2 hives would throw a dozen swarms and the dozen throw a dozen more, and by the following summer the hollow straw would hum with more bees than the whole valley had ever seen in one place. She was, in other words, playing a longer game than a desperate man can usually afford to play, and she knew that the mortgage came due in April, before the great summer flow could ever fill a single jar. And she carried that knowledge quietly and told no one, least of all Reuben, that the bees alone could not save the farm in time. She had another plan for the spring debt, a colder and more dangerous one, and it had nothing to do with honey and everything to do with the reason she could read a ledger as well as she could read a hive. But that was for later. For now there was the fall to get through, and a marriage to learn the shape of, and a town to be measured by. The town came to look. Word travels in a thin country, and word that the mail-order woman out at the Hollis place had walked bare-handed among the cursed Hollis bees and lived, that she had torn the old gums apart and built strange new box hives and got the whole dead apiary humming again, that traveled faster than most. Within a fortnight there was hardly a soul in Millard's Ford who had not found some errand to carry them out the south road past the Hollis draw, and they would slow their wagons at the fence line and look at the row of neat white hives where the crooked gray graves had stood. And some of them nodded and some of them frowned, and a good many of them said, in the mercantile and the saloon, that it would not last, that bees were a chancy business and a woman a shancier one, and the two together nothing a sensible man would stake a farm on. Prudence Galt, who kept the store and had a kind heart under a blunt tongue, told Cordelia as much straight out, the first time Cordelia drove in for supplies. They're saying you've bewitched Reuben Hollis and his bees both, Prudence said, weighing out cornmeal. I'll not repeat the worst of it. You want to know who's saying the loudest? I expect you'll tell me either way. Prudence almost smiled. Dalton Fry, she said. And the name meant nothing to Cordelia then, and she filed it away, because she had learned to file away names the way a careful clerk files away figures against the day they came due. He's the honey and produce buyer, runs the commission house down in Alder Junction where the railroad is, buys the whole valley's honey and eggs and butter and dried fruit and freights it east, and there's not a farm family in 40 miles doesn't sell through Dalton Fry, because there's nobody else to sell through. He's not fond of surprises, Dalton Fry, and a farm that starts making real honey where there was none is a surprise. You'll meet him. Everybody meets him. Cordelia paid for her cornmeal and drove home in the blue dusk, turning that name over. Dalton Fry, the man through whom the whole valley's honey must pass, the single narrow gate between every farm's labor and the money that labor was worth. And something in the careful clerk's mind she kept beneath the beekeeper's hands went very still and very alert, the way it always did when she caught the first far scent of the particular kind of wrong she had learned, at ruinous cost, to smell. She said nothing to Reuben. But that night, after he had gone out to his pallet in the barn, she took from the false bottom of her bound hamper the one thing she had carried across 400 miles and shown no living soul, a slim, worn, calfskin account book, its pages covered in her own small, precise hand. The ledger of another man's fraud in another place, the ledger that had cost her everything and taught her, in the losing of it, exactly how a thief who stands between honest people and their money does the stealing. She did not open it that night. She only held it a moment in the lamplight, and then she put it away, and she lay down in the wall bed and listened to the windmill, and she thought, not for the first time, that a person is never truly rid of the thing that ruined them, that the best a body can hope for is to turn the shape of the old wound into a tool and use it. Autumn deepened. The plum leaves fell, and the grass went tawny, and the great V's of geese crossed the enormous sky going south, and Cordelia Vane learned her husband slowly, the way you learn a hive, by watching and not by asking. She learned that Reuben Hollis worked himself past exhaustion, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant Margaret. She learned that he was scrupulously, painfully honest, that he undercounted his own cattle when the tax man came, rather than risk cheating the county by a single head, that he had beggared himself, partly because he would not do the small dishonest things his neighbors did to get by. She learned that he was gentle with animals and hard on himself, and shy to the point of pain around any kindness offered him, and that under all of it, buried deep and long neglected, there was a man capable of a warmth that frightened him, and that the frightening of him was the whole trouble. And Reuben, in his turn, learned her, though he would not have admitted he was studying her at all. He learned that she never complained, that she met bad news with a stillness rather than tears, that she could stretch a poor pantry into good meals and mend what he thought past mending, and work a full hard day, and never once ask him for softness or credit or thanks. He learned that she talked to the bees, low and easy, when she thought no one heard. And he learned, though it was a long while before he let himself know that he had learned it, that the house was no longer a place he dreaded coming into out of the dark, and that the silence which had rattled the empty rooms for 2 grieving years had somehow, without his marking, the day it happened, become a different kind of silence, the settled quiet of a place with a living heart in it, and that he had begun, God help him, to look forward to the lamp in the window at the end of the day. The first hard crack in the wall between them came with the first hard weather. A norther blew down out of the Dakotas the second week of November, a wall of blue-black cloud that swallowed the sun at mid-morning and dropped the temperature 40 degrees inside an hour, and drove a wind before it that laid the tawny grass flat and screamed under the eaves of the barn. Reuben was out with the cattle when it hit, hazing the thin fall herd down off the open flats into the shelter of the home draw, and Cordelia, watching the wall of weather come on from the kitchen window, did not think of the cattle or the house or herself. She thought of the bees, 2 colonies, the whole of the year's work and the whole of next year's hope, standing exposed on the open ground of the willow draw where the wind would find them, and a cold like this coming so fast and so early could chill a fall cluster through before it had the numbers or the stores to hold its heat, and kill, in a single night, what she had spent 2 months building. She pulled Margaret's stiff dead shawl off the rocker without thinking, threw it round her shoulders, and went out into the teeth of it. She spent the worst 2 hours of that storm on her knees in the driving sleet among the hives, banking them, dragging fallen willow boughs and old hay and sod against the north and west sides, weighting the lids with stones against the wind, packing the entrances down to a single bee's width to hold the warmth, and her hands went past cold to a deep aching numbness, and her skirts froze stiff as boards, and still she worked. Because there is a kind of work a person will do for a living thing they have set themselves to save that they would not do to save their own comfort or even their own skin. That was how Reuben found her. He had got the cattle down and turned to the house and found it empty and the fire dying and his new wife gone out into a killing storm. And the fear that went through him in that moment was a thing he was not prepared for, a fear far out of proportion to a contract, a fear the size of the one he had felt 2 years before standing helpless by another bed, and he ran out into the storm shouting her name against a wind that tore it to nothing. And he found her at last on her knees in the sleet among the hives, blue-lipped and shaking and very nearly past getting up on her own, banking the last of the boughs against the last of the gums with hands she could no longer feel. He did not say a word. He gathered her up out of the frozen grass, shawl and frozen skirts and all, and he carried her against his chest through the screaming dark to the house, and he kicked the door shut on the storm and set her down by the stove, and built the fire up roaring and stripped the frozen shawl and the ice-stiff shawl off her, and wrapped her in every dry blanket in the house, and chafed the frozen hands between his own big, warm, calloused ones, and all the while he was doing it, he was saying things, low and rough and half to himself. The sort of things a closed man says only when fear has knocked the door off its hinges. "You could have died out there," he said. "Over bees. You could have died over a pair of hives, you foolish, foolish woman." But his hands, chafing hers, were gentle past anything his voice had ever been. And when the feeling came screaming back into her fingers and she gasped with the pain of it, his face went stricken, and she understood through the fog of cold and the fire of returning blood that Reuben Hollis was not angry at her at all. He was terrified. He was a man who had lost one woman to a cold bed and could not, it turned out, bear the thought of losing another, and the discovery of that had ambushed him in a storm and left him with nowhere to hide it. "The bees would have died," she said when she could speak. Her teeth were chattering. "I couldn't let them. I'm sorry I frightened you." The bees. He sat back on his heels and looked at her, wrapped in his blankets by his fire, and something broke open in his weathered face that had been sealed a long time. "Margaret loved those bees," he said, very low. "And I let them die because I couldn't. I didn't know how. And I didn't try hard enough. Because trying meant, and you go out in a norther on your knees in the ice for 2 hives that aren't even yours. And he stopped. He could not finish it. He did not have the words, or he had them and could not say them, and Cordelia, watching him struggle, did for him what he could not do for himself. "They're mine now," she said gently. "You gave them to me, and I don't lose the things I'm given, Reuben. Not if there's breath in me to stop it. That's all it was. That's the whole of it." He looked at her a long moment, and then he nodded, and he got up and put more wood on the fire, and made her hot coffee laced with the little sugar they had, and neither of them spoke of it again in words. But the wall between them was down, or nearly down, and they both knew it, and something new and unspoken and very careful had come to live in the house with them. And in the morning, when the storm had blown itself out, and the world lay white and silent and glittering under a hard blue sky, they went out together to the willows and found every hive standing, banked and weighted and alive, the entrances furred with frost but the clusters warm within. And Reuben Hollis put his hand for a moment on his wife's shoulder, the first time he had touched her that was not necessity, and left it there, and said, "Margaret would have thanked you. I'll thank you in her place." It was, from that man, a declaration. She met Dalton Fry a week later. He came out to the Hollis place himself, which Prudence Galt said later he almost never did. Drove out in a fine varnished buggy behind a matched pair with a hired man up beside him. And Cordelia, watching him step down into the swept yard in a good broadcloth coat and a hat that had cost more than the Hollis milk cow, knew the type before he had said a word. Dalton Fry was perhaps 50, smooth and heavy and pleasant-faced, with a soft, careful voice and small, shrewd eyes that did their work while the pleasant face smiled. And he shook Reuben's hand and complimented the mended barn, and admired the neat white hives from a safe distance, with the easy warmth of a man who has found that warmth is cheaper than honesty and generally serves as well. I'd heard the Hollis bees had come back to life, he said, smiling round at all of them. I confess, I didn't credit it. But there they stand. Well, it's a fine thing. A fine thing. I like to see a farm turn a corner. And you'll be wanting a market for your honey come summer, naturally, and I'm your man for that, ma'am, same as I'm every family's man in this valley. I take the whole district's crop, honey and wax and eggs and butter, and I see it freighted east and I get you your money. And you needn't trouble your head with any of the buying and selling and the freight tariffs and the eastern prices, which are a mystery to farming folk, and best left to them as understands them. You just make your honey and bring it to my house in Alder Junction, and I'll see you paid fair. He said fair the way a card sharp says trust me, and Cordelia smiled back at him just as pleasantly and said how kind and how glad they were to have a buyer so near, and she asked him, in the mild, guileless voice of a farm wife making conversation, one or two small questions. What did honey fetch, then, in the eastern markets these days? And how did he reckon the freight against it? And did he pay by the pound of the comb or the pound of the strained honey? And at what price? And when? Dalton Fry answered her the way a man answers a woman he has decided is no threat. Easily and vaguely and with a great many soft words that added up, when she sorted them in the still clerk's part of her mind, to almost no actual figures at all, and every place where a figure should have been, he had put a reassurance instead. And Cordelia Vane stood in her yard and smiled and nodded and thanked him, and behind the smile the calfskin ledger in the false bottom of her hamper seemed to grow warm, because she had heard this voice before. She had been ruined by this voice before. She knew, standing there in the cold, bright yard, with a certainty she could not yet prove, that Dalton Fry was robbing the whole valley blind through the one narrow gate they all had to pass their labor through, and that he had been doing it for years, in the dark behind the pleasant face, the way such men always did, and that not one of these honest, overworked farm families had the figures or the leisure or the particular hard-won knowledge to catch him at it. But she did. God help her, of all the women who might have stepped off a freight wagon into Millard's Ford, she was the one woman in 400 miles who knew exactly how this particular theft was done, because she had watched it done to her own family, in another valley, in another year, by another smiling man, and she had learned every move of it too late to save anyone she loved. She was not going to be too late twice. She told Reuben the truth of herself on a still, cold night in the first week of December, and she chose to tell him not because the plan required it, but because the marriage did, because the wall between them was down, and she found she could no longer keep a false floor in her hamper and a true one in her heart. They were sitting by the stove after supper, he mending harness and she darning, in the ordinary companionable quiet that had grown up between them, and she set down her needle and said, "You've never asked me why I came." He looked up. "Didn't think it was my business. A person that comes west is generally running from something or toward something, and either way it keeps. I'll tell you anyhow." And she did. She told him she had not always been poor. She told him she had been raised in a green valley in Ohio, the only child of a father who kept bees, 40 hives and more, the best honey in 3 counties, and a mother who kept the books, and that she had grown up with her hands in comb and her head in ledgers both, the 2 things that were now the whole of what she owned. She told him that when she was 19 a man had come to their valley, a smooth, heavy, pleasant-faced man who bought the district's honey and freighted it east and got the farmers their money, a man everyone trusted because there was no one else to sell through, and that this man had robbed them all for years, a little at a time, shorting the weights and lying about the Eastern prices and larding false charges onto the freight, and that her father, who was honest to a fault and no hand with figures, had never caught it. She told him that she had caught it, that at 23, keeping her ailing mother's books, she had begun to see the pattern in the numbers, the small, steady wrongness of them, and that she had spent 2 years secretly gathering the proof, copying every weight ticket and every account, building the ledger that would prove the theft. And she told him how it had ended, that the smooth man, learning what she was doing, had moved first, had called in her father's debts all at once through the bank he half owned, had ruined them in a single season before she could bring her proof to bear, had taken the farm and the hives and the house, and that her father had not survived the losing of it, had died within the year of nothing the doctor could name but a broken heart, and her mother soon after, and that she, Cordelia, had been left at 25 with nothing in the world but a fine name, an empty purse, a head full of a dead man's swindle, and a calfskin ledger full of proof she had gathered 1 year too late to save anyone. So I answered your advertisement, she said, and I came west, because there was nothing left for me where I was but graves, and because a woman alone with no money has few honest roads, and I wanted an honest one. I did not come meaning to tell you any of this. I meant to keep it in the false bottom of my hamper and be a good plain wife and never trouble you with it. But I can't keep a false bottom in the house we've made, Reuben. It isn't honest, and you are the most honest man I have ever known, and I find I would rather you knew the worst of me and what I carry than have you married to half a woman. Reuben Hollis had put down his harness somewhere in the middle of it. He sat a long while when she had finished, looking at her in the lamplight, and she could not read his face, and she waited, because she had said her piece, and there was nothing to do now but let him weigh it. When he spoke, his voice was rough. Dalton Fry, he said. It was not a question. Yes, you knew him the minute he stepped down out of that buggy. I knew his kind the minute I heard his voice. I've been near certain since, and I'll be sure once I see his weight tickets and his accounts against the real Eastern prices. He's doing to this whole valley what was done to my father. I'd stake my life on it. I have, in a manner of speaking, staked my life on catching such a man once already, and I lost, and it cost me everyone I loved. She looked at him steadily. I'm telling you because if I go after him, I'll be putting this farm in his sights, the way my father's farm came into his sights, and I'll not do that to you in secret. It's your land and your banknote and your neighbor to make an enemy of, so I'm asking you plain. Do I let it lie and just make you your honey and pay what we can and hope? Or do I do the thing I came into this valley knowing how to do, and try to take him down before he can do to these people what he did to mine? It was the longest speech either of them had made to the other. And when it was done, the little house was very quiet, only the fire ticking and the wind walking soft along the eaves. Reuben got up. He went to the window and stood looking out at the dark and the far cold stars over the sandhills. And Cordelia watched his back and made herself ready to hear him say, "Let it lie," because he was a beaten, cautious man who had lost enough and had a note due in April, and every reason in the world to keep his head down and give a rich and dangerous neighbor no cause. But that was not what Reuben Hollis said. When he turned around, his face had a look in it she had not seen there before. Not the guarded flatness and not the buried warmth, but something harder and cleaner. The look of a mild man who has finally been handed a thing worth stopping being mild about. My father, he said slowly, sold through a man like your Dalton Fry, back in Illinois, when I was a boy. I remember him coming home from the buyers with less than he'd reckoned, year on year, and not being able to say why, and calling himself a fool for it, and my mother crying over the accounts at night when she thought we slept. I grew up thinking my father was a poor manager. Maybe he was. Or maybe there was a smiling man with his thumb on the scale the whole time, and my father died believing it was his own fault. He came back to the fire. I've watched every family in this valley break their backs and stay poor year on year and tell each other it's the drought or the grasshoppers or the eastern banks, and maybe it's all of that. But if it's also a man in a varnished buggy with his thumb on the scale, and you're the one soul in 40 miles who can prove it, he stopped. His jaw worked. Then no. We don't let it lie. You go after him, Cordelia, and you won't go after him alone the way you did before, whatever it costs us. There's some things a man ought to lose a farm over, if it comes to that, and I'd rather lose this one fighting a thief than keep it kneeling to one. She looked at him, and she felt something turn over in her chest that she had thought the last 2 years had killed for good, and she understood in that moment that the contract was gone. That somewhere between the norther and this fire it had become the other thing, the real thing, the thing neither of them had come west expecting or daring to want. She did not say so. Neither did he, but she got up and crossed the little room and put her hand over his where it rested on the mantel, and he turned his hand and took hers, and they stood like that a while in the firelight. Two people who had each been ruined once and had each stopped hoping, holding on, and that was the whole of it. And it was enough. So the long plan began, and it was a winter's work, patient and secret and cold. Cordelia could not simply accuse Dalton Fry. She had learned in the hardest possible school that an accusation without proof is a gift to the accused. That the smooth man had beaten her father precisely because she had moved too soon and shown her hand. This time she would gather the whole of it first, in silence, and strike only when the proof was so complete that no pleasant voice on earth could talk its way clear. She needed 3 things. She needed to know the true Eastern price of honey and butter and eggs, the real figures from the real commission markets in Omaha and Chicago, against which Fry's soft, vague numbers could be measured. She needed the true freight tariff, the actual published cost of shipping 100 weight east on the railroad, against which his inflated charges could be weighed. And she needed the district's own weight tickets and account slips, the little scraps of paper Fry handed each family when he bought their crop, gathered from as many farms as she could quietly reach, so that the pattern of the shorting could be laid out plain and undeniable across dozens of honest households at once. None of it could be got quickly, and none of it could be got openly, and so she set about it through the long, dark heart of that winter the way she did everything, slowly, steadily, and without a wasted motion. Prudence Galt was the key that unlocked the rest, though it took Cordelia a month of Saturdays to turn her. Cordelia drove into the Ford every week, ostensibly for supplies, truly to sit by the mercantile stove and let the storekeeper's wife come to trust her, and slowly over cornmeal and thread and the small talk of women, she learned that Prudence Galt had a grievance of her own against Dalton Fry, an old buried one, that the Galts had lost a good part of a year's egg and butter money to Fry's accounting the winter their youngest was sick and the doctor had to be paid, and that Prudence had never quite believed the figures, and never been able to fight them, and never forgiven them. When Cordelia judged the moment ripe, she told Prudence quietly over the stove a little of the truth, that she had reason to think Fry was shorting the whole valley, and that she meant to prove it, and she asked the storekeeper's wife for help. And Prudence Galt, who saw every farm family in the district come through her store, and knew every one of them and their troubles, and who had her own cold reasons to want the smooth man's thumb lifted off the scale, became Cordelia's quiet road into every household in the valley. It was Prudence who let it be known, farm wife to farm wife, in the careful sideways way such things travel among women, that the beekeeper out at the Hollis place was gathering the little paper slips Fry handed out at buying time, and would anyone who still had theirs care to lend them, just to lend them, no questions and no talk. And they came, a slip at a time, folded into a flower order or slipped across the mercantile counter, the weight tickets and account stubs of 40 struggling households began to make their way to Cordelia Vane. And she copied each one in her small, precise hand into a great sheet she kept hidden beneath the false bottom of her hamper alongside her father's old ledger. The year, the family, the pounds of honey or butter or eggs, the price Fry had paid, the charges he had taken off. And a pattern rose up out of those scraps like a shape coming clear out of fog, and it was exactly, precisely, damningly the pattern she had known she would find, because it was the same pattern that had ruined her father, the same thief's arithmetic. The weights marked light, the Eastern price quoted low, the freight charged high, a few cents stolen off every pound, off every family, off every season. Cents that meant nothing to Dalton Fry one at a time and added up, across 40 farms and a dozen years, to a stolen fortune and a valley kept poor. She still needed the true numbers to measure his lies against, and those she could not get in the sandhills. So Reuben, who had a cousin married to a grain man in Omaha, wrote East plain careful letters asking for the current commission house prices on honey, butter, and eggs, and the published railroad freight tariff for produce, and after a long, anxious month the answers came back, folded in the cousin's letters, the real figures at last, the honest Eastern market price, and the honest cost of freight. And when Cordelia laid those true numbers beside Dalton Fry's numbers, the theft stood up off the paper so plain and so large that even Reuben, no hand with figures, could see it at a glance. Fry had been paying the valley barely half what its honey and butter and eggs were worth in the East, and charging it near double the true freight besides, and pocketing the whole vast difference. Year on year, farm on farm, while every family in the district broke its back and stayed poor and blamed the drought. It was laid out on Cordelia's great hidden sheet in her small, merciless hand, one of the quiet, ordinary, monstrous thefts by which a hard country is kept hard, and she had it now. All of it, cold and complete and undeniable, and all that remained was to choose the time and the manner of the striking. But Dalton Fry, it turned out, had not become a rich man in a poor valley by being a fool, and he had begun, through that same long winter, to feel the small first tremors of something moving against him. A buyer who has robbed a district for a dozen years develops a kind of animal sense for the mood of it, and Fry began to notice things, that families who had always sold him their little store of winter eggs held some back now, that the storekeeper's wife had gone cool to him, that the beekeeper woman out at the Hollis place asked too many quiet questions and gathered he was told by a boy he paid to tell him things. A great many small papers. He did not know what she was doing, but he knew enough to be uneasy, and an uneasy thief with money and a half share in a bank does not wait to be struck. He strikes first. Which is exactly what he had done to her father, and exactly what Cordelia had told Reuben he would do, and it came, as she had feared it would, through the note. It was the middle of February, the hardest part of the winter, the bees clustered tight, and the cattle gaunt, and the whole white country holding its breath towards spring, when Reuben rode back from the Ford Gray faced with a paper in his coat. The bank had sold the Hollis note. Where the mortgage had been held quietly by the Little Millard's Ford Bank, due the 1st of April, it had been bought up, the whole $640 of it, by a private party. And the private party had exercised a clause none of them had thought to fear, and called the entire balance due at once in 30 days on the 15th of March, principal and interest, all of it, in cash or the farm and everything on it, the barn, the house, the cattle, the hives, would go to the buyer of the note. And the buyer of the note, though the paper hid it behind a lawyer's name, was, as Cordelia knew the instant Reuben told her, Dalton Fry. He had done it exactly as it had been done to her father. He had not troubled to learn what proof she held or how far along she was. He had simply reached out through the bank he half owned and closed his hand around the one thing that could stop her, the roof over her head and the ground under her hives, and moved to crush the Hollis place into ruin and scatter its troublesome woman back onto the road before she could bring whatever she was building to bear. 30 days. $640 they did not have and could not raise, the fall cattle already sold for a third of it, no honey to sell till summer, no crop, no time. It was, on its face, exactly the checkmate that had beaten her before. She sat at the scoured table with the cruel paper in her hands, and for one long black moment she was 23 again, watching another smiling man reach through another bank to take everything before she was ready. And she felt the old helplessness rise up cold in her throat. And then she felt Reuben's hand close over her shoulder, steady and warm and certain, and she heard him say, above her, in a voice with no fear left in it at all, "He's shown his hand, Cordelia." A man that's sure of himself doesn't need to buy up a note and call it early. He's frightened. He's frightened of you. Frightened men make mistakes. And she looked up at her husband, this beaten, cautious man made suddenly unafraid by the very thing that ought to have finished him, and she felt the cold helplessness break, and the old hard clear resolve come up under it, stronger than it had ever been. Because this time, she was not a girl alone. This time she had 30 days, and a complete proof, and a partner, and a whole valley full of robbed and weary people who did not yet know that the thief who had bled them white had just made the one mistake she needed. "You're right," she said, and she stood up, and she laid the cruel paper flat on the table and smoothed it with her hand. "He's frightened, and he's shown his hand, and 30 days is enough. But not to raise the money, Reuben. We'll never raise $640 in 30 days of February. And he knows it, and that's the trap. We don't play the game he set. We turn the board over. If Dalton Fry wants to call the whole valley's debt due on the 15th of March, then the 15th of March is the day the whole valley learns exactly what Dalton Fry has been doing to it. He's given us a date and a reason to bring every family in the district together in one room. We're going to use them both." The next weeks were the busiest and most dangerous of Cordelia's life. She could not let Fry learn what was coming. A thief warned is a thief, with time to burn his records, and buy a lawyer, and turn the valley's fear against her. So the work went on in silence, through Prudence Galt and a handful of trusted farm wives, family to family. In the sideways careful way, the word passed that there would be a gathering at the church in Millard's Ford on the afternoon of the 15th of March, and that anyone who had ever sold honey or butter or eggs to Dalton Fry and wondered why they stayed poor should come and bring, if they still had it, every buying slip Fry had ever handed them. No reason was given in the open. But a thing was in the air by then. That long, slow winter of quiet questions had put it there, and the valley came. Meanwhile, Cordelia built her case for the eyes of plain people. It was not enough to be right, she had learned that too, in the worst way. Her father had been right and had lost. To win, the theft had to be made so simple that a tired farmer who had never seen a commission house price in his life could look at it and understand in one breath that he had been robbed. So she made great clean sheets in her small clear hand, one theft at a time, family by family. Here is what your honey was worth in Omaha, the true number. From the true market. Here is what Dalton Fry paid you. Here is the true cost to freight it east. Here is what Dalton Fry charged you. Here is the difference in dollars that came out of your pocket and went into his this year and this year and this year. She laid them out so that a man had only to run his eye down 2 columns and see his own name and his own stolen money. And she made 40 of them, 40 families, and the sum of all of them, the whole valley's 12-year bleeding, she totaled on one last sheet, and the number at the bottom of that sheet was large enough to buy the town. On the morning of the 15th of March, the melt was running in the draws, and the sky was high and pale, and the whole district came to Millard's Ford. They filled the paint-hungry church and stood along the walls and crowded in the doorway. Wind-burned men in their one good coat and weary women with children on their hips, 40 families and more, come without quite knowing why, except that the beekeeper woman and Prudence Galt had asked them, and something in the winter had told them to. And Dalton Fry came too, because a man like Fry cannot bear a gathering he has not been told the purpose of. And he came in his good broadcloth with 2 of his men, and he stood at the back with his pleasant face and his small, shrewd, watching eyes, expecting, Cordelia thought, to find some feeble grievance he could smooth over with soft words, as he had smoothed over every grievance for a dozen years. Reuben stood up first, because it was right that the man of the threatened farm speak first, and because a woman standing up alone before that hard crowd would have lost half of them before she began. He was no speaker, Reuben Hollis, and his voice shook at the start, but he told them plainly that his note had been bought up in secret, and called due that very day by a private party, and that he stood to lose his farm by nightfall, and that he had thought, as they all thought, that his troubles were his own fault and his own poor management, until his wife had shown him they were not. And then he said, "I'll let her tell it. She's the one that can prove it. Listen to her the way you'd listen to a man, because she's earned it twice over." And he sat down, and Cordelia Vane stood up before the whole valley with her sheets in her hand. She did not raise her voice. She had learned that the truth, laid out plain, does not need to be shouted, that a quiet, certain voice carries further in a crowded room than a loud one. She told them who she was. She told them, briefly and without self-pity, about her father's valley in Ohio, and the smiling man who had bled it, and the proof she had gathered 1 year too late. And then she said, "I did not know, when I came west to marry a stranger, that I would find the same thief working the same theft in a new valley. But I have, and this time I am not too late." And she began to read the numbers. She read them family by family, and it was the most terrible and wonderful thing that Plain Church had ever held. Because as she read one household at a time, each family heard its own name and its own honest labor and the exact number of dollars that had been quietly stolen from it year upon year. And a sound rose up out of that crowd that started as a murmur and grew, not a shout. Something deeper and worse for Dalton Fry than any shout, the low gathering growl of 40 families understanding all at once, together, that their poverty had a face, and that the face had been smiling at them across a buying counter for 12 years. She held up the true Eastern prices. She held up the true freight tariff, published plain by the railroad, that any of them could check. She laid Fry's numbers beside the true numbers so a child could read the gap. And at the last she held up the final sheet, the whole valley's 12-year loss totaled at the bottom, and she let them look at it in silence, and then she said, into that silence, that is what was taken from this valley. Not by the drought, not by the grasshoppers, not by the eastern banks, by one man, standing at the back of this room, who bought up my husband's note this week and called it due today, because he learned I was gathering these papers, and hoped to break my farm and drive me off before you ever saw them. He was almost quick enough. He was 1 month too slow. And the whole church turned, as one body, and looked at Dalton Fry. To his lasting credit as a card player and his eternal damnation as a man, Frey did not run. He smiled, that soft, pleasant smile, and he spread his hands and he began to talk, the smooth, easy, reasonable words rolling out, that these were complicated matters, that freight and commission and eastern prices were a mystery to farming folk, that this poor woman had suffered a tragedy back east and was seeing old ghosts in honest business, that he had served this valley faithfully for 12 years and was hurt, deeply hurt, to be so accused. It was a good performance. It was the same performance that had beaten her father. And it broke against Cordelia Vane, like water against a stone, because this time the proof was already in the room, already in 40 pairs of hands, already understood, and the smooth words had nothing left to work on. The freight tariff is published by the railroad, Mr. Fry, she said, quietly, when he paused for breath. It is not a mystery. It is printed on a sheet any man here can send for. The Omaha Commission prices are printed in the market papers every week. They are not a mystery either. The only mystery in this valley for 12 years has been why 40 hard-working families stayed poor. And I have just read you the answer, and every family here is holding a copy of it. You are welcome to explain the numbers. Please do. Start with the Galt account, the winter their child was sick. Explain to Prudence Galt, to her face, where her butter money went. And Dalton Fry, for the first time, had nothing to say. The pleasant face came apart, and 40 families watched it come apart, and knew. What followed was not a shout or a mob, and Cordelia was glad of it, for she had feared that end and taken care against it. It was worse for Dalton Fry than a mob, and better for the valley. It was the slow, cold, terrible turning of 40 honest households who had at last been shown the truth and would never again be smiled at across that buying counter. There was a man in the church that afternoon, an older farmer named Enos Hardaway, who had lost more to Fry than most and who had, it turned out, sat 2 terms as a county commissioner years before. And it was Hardaway who stood up in the settling silence and said, in a voice gone hard, that these papers would go before the county attorney at Alder Junction that very week, and that a man who defrauds 40 families through false weights and false accounts has committed a crime the law has words for, and that if the county attorney would not act then, the district would swear out the complaint itself and see it carried to the territorial court. And a low sound of agreement went round that church that was more binding than any oath. Dalton Fry left before it was finished. He gathered his 2 men with a jerk of his head, and he went out into the pale March light with what dignity he could carry. And he did not smile again. And within the month, before the county attorney had well begun, he had sold his commission house at Alder Junction and quit the valley for good, gone east or gone west. No one much cared which. Run off ahead of the reckoning the way such men generally do when the numbers finally catch them, leaving behind the stolen fortune of a lifetime he could not carry and could not explain. But before he ran, one thing was settled, and it was the thing that mattered most to the Hollis place. the note. It was Enos Hardaway again, and Prudence Galt's husband, the storekeeper, and 2 or 3 of the more solid men of the district who took Cordelia's proof to the Little Millard's Ford Bank the very next morning and laid it on the banker's desk. And the banker, a cautious small-town man who had sold the Hollis note to Fry's lawyer without knowing or much wanting to know the whole of it, looked at 40 families' worth of documented fraud committed by the very man he had just done business with, and understood in about 1 minute that his bank's name could not afford to be anywhere near Dalton Fry when the county attorney opened his files. The sale of the note was quietly undone. Whether Fry, running, was glad to be rid of it, or whether the bank simply bought it back to save its own skin, Cordelia never learned and never cared. What she knew was that Reuben rode home on the 16th of March with a different paper in his coat, and this one said that the Hollis note was back where it had been, held by the little local bank, not due until the 1st of April. $640 still owed and still fearsome, but no longer a knife at their throat by nightfall. They had not raised the money, but they had beaten the trap and turned the board over and freed the valley in the doing of it, and now they had a spring and a summer to find their feet, and a whole district that would never forget what the beekeeper woman had done for it. That was worth more, in the end, than money, though it would take a season or 2 to turn into money, as such things do. The reckoning between the 2 of them came that same night, and it was the quietest scene in the whole of it, and the truest. They sat up late by the stove, too wrung out to sleep, the terrible day behind them and the note bought back and the house still theirs, and for a long while neither spoke. Then Reuben said, looking at the fire and not at her, "I want to be straight with you about something, and I'm no good at it, so bear with me. I'll bear with you. When you told me, back in December, what you'd come here carrying, I said we'd go after him whatever it cost. I meant it. But I'll not pretend I wasn't afraid the whole winter through. There were nights I lay out in that barn thinking we'd lose the place over your fight, and part of me was angry at you for bringing it into my house. And I want to say that plain, because you've been honest with me from the first day, and you're owed the same. I was angry, and I was afraid, and I stayed in the fight anyway. And I need you to know it was both. I'm not a brave man that wasn't scared. I'm a scared man that stayed." Cordelia looked at him, and her eyes stung, because it was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her, and honesty was the one coin she valued above all others, having been ruined by its opposite. "That's braver than not being afraid," she said. "Any fool can fight a thing he isn't scared of." Maybe he turned from the fire and looked at her at last. "There's a thing I've been trying not to know since a norther in November, and I'm done trying not to know it. I didn't send for a wife. I sent for a pair of hands and a way to quiet the house. That's the God's truth of what I wanted, and I'm ashamed of it now. But that's not what I've got, and it hasn't been for a long while. And I don't want to go on calling this a contract when we both know it stopped being one somewhere back in the winter." He stopped and swallowed and made himself finish it. "I've come to love you, Cordelia. I don't say it easy, and I'll likely not say it often, being made the way I'm made. But I'll not have you sleeping in the wall bed and me in the barn like strangers who share a farm. Not anymore. If you'll have me. And if you won't, or you're not ready, I'll wait, and I'll not say another word about it, and nothing changes about the place or the bees or any of it. But I had to say it once, plain, the way you'd say a thing." It was the longest and hardest speech Reuben Hollis had ever made, and when it was done he sat there braced for anything, the way he braced for most things, expecting to be disappointed. and Cordelia Vane, who had come west with nothing but a false, bottomed hamper and a dead man's ledger and a heart she had thought past thawing, got up from her chair and crossed the little fire-lit room and stood before her husband and took his weathered face in both her hands. "I stopped sleeping easy in that wall bed a long time ago," she said. "I've been waiting on you to catch up." And that was the whole of the reckoning, and it needed no more words than that. And there were none spoken. The marriage that had begun as a contract on a wagon seat became, that March night by the stove, the real and lasting thing it would remain for the rest of their 2 long lives. The note came due the 1st of April, and they did not have the whole of it, but the little bank, with Dalton Fry's ruin fresh in its mind and the whole freed valley now watching how it treated the Hollis place, took the third that Reuben could pay, and renewed the rest at an honest rate and gave them until the fall. And that was all Cordelia had needed, because she knew what the summer would bring. The summer brought the bees. Those 2 colonies she had carried through the winter on her knees in a norther, split and split again through the warm months by her patient practiced hands, through swarm after swarm into the empty white hives Reuben built her all through the spring, and by the height of the great summer flow, when the sweet clover and the wild alfalfa and the vast purple drifts of bee plant bloomed across the draws that the whole valley had thought were only weeds, the Hollis home draw hummed with more bees than anyone in the sandhills had ever seen in one place. 40 hives and better, where 14 dying gums had stood. A river of gold going out to the flowers at dawn and coming home heavy at dusk. And the honey they made was the finest that country had ever tasted. Pale and clear and clover sweet, and it came off those hives in the fall by the barrel. And there was by then an honest man to sell it through, for when Dalton Fry ran, he left the valley with no buyer at all, and it was Cordelia who saw that the district must never again put its whole labor through one man's single narrow gate. And it was Cordelia, with her head for figures, and Prudence Galt for a partner, and Enos Hardaway for a name the county trusted, who helped the farm family set up a thing new to that country, a growers' association of their own, that pooled the valley's honey and butter and eggs and shipped it east together at the true freight and sold it at the true price and divided the money fair. No smiling man's thumb anywhere near the scale. It was slow to build and clumsy at first, and Cordelia kept its books those first years herself, in the same small, precise hand that had brought down the thief, and within 3 seasons the association had done what 12 years of Dalton Fry had made everyone believe impossible. It had made the valley prosperous. Not rich. The sandhills never made anyone rich, but prosperous, solvent, fed, a country where a hard-working family could clear its debts and paint its church and send its children to a school that ran the whole winter. And every family in the district knew to the dollar whose winter of quiet questions and whose 40 patient copied sheets had turned the tide. And the beekeeper woman from the Hollis place was, by the time she was 30, the most respected soul in 40 miles, though she never once put herself forward as anything but a farm wife with a knack for bees and figures. The Hollis note was paid in full, the whole $640 of it, out of the first 2 seasons' honey, on a bright October morning in the year 1885, and Reuben brought the canceled paper home, and they burned it together in the stove and stood watching it go. And then they walked out to the willow draw in the low gold light and stood among the humming hives, his arm around her. And neither of them said anything, because by then they had learned that the best things between them needed no saying. The land was theirs, clear and unencumbered, the first Hollis to hold it free since Reuben's father broke the sod, and it was hers as much as his. Everyone understood that now the woman who had walked bare headed among the cursed bees and read the thief's numbers to the whole valley in a paint-hungry church, and stayed on her knees in a killing storm for 2 hives that were the seed of all of it. They had a long life on that place. That is the part the pamphlets never tell. The long, ordinary middle of a thing. And it was the best of it. They had 2 sons and a daughter, born in the front room where the wall bed had been, and the empty, stripped room behind the curtain that Reuben had not been able to use or shut became a children's room full of noise, and Margaret's dead shawl, the one Cordelia had worn into the norther, was mended and worn soft and passed down. And no jealousy ever lived in that house over the first wife's name, because Cordelia had saved the thing Margaret loved and honored her in the saving of it. And Reuben loved his second wife the more for how she carried his first one's memory, gently, without fear. The bees grew into a legend. Folks came from 3 counties for the Hollis honey, and to buy queens and swarms from the woman who had a hand for them nobody else could match, and she taught the craft freely to any farm wife who asked, so that within a decade there was hardly a homestead in the valley without a few hives humming behind the willows and the sandhills, which the eastern papers still called a hard, poor waste of a country, ran quietly gold with honey every summer, because one ruined woman had stepped off a freight wagon into it with a knack and a ledger and a promise she meant to keep. Reuben Hollis died in the spring of the year 1921, at the age of 73, in the bed in the front room, with his wife's hand in his and his grown children near, in a life he had never seen coming when he rode away for a plain pair of working hands, and would not, he told her near the end, have traded for any other life a man could have been offered. His last words to her were not grand, being made the way he was made. He said, "The clover's going to come in heavy this year. You'll want the new hives ready." And she said she would have them ready. And she did. Cordelia Vane Hollis lived 9 years more. She kept the bees to the last, thin and white-haired and straight-backed among the humming hives in the willow shade, and she kept the association's books until her eyes failed, and she died in the autumn of the year 1930, at the age of 72, in the house that had been her home for 47 years, and they buried her beside Reuben on the low rise above the home draw, where a person could see the whole valley she had freed spread out gold and green below. She left the land to her children clear, and a growers' association that outlived her by 2 generations, and a valley full of hives, and a reputation for honesty and figures that is spoken of in that country yet. But if you had asked her, near the end, what she had made of the hard journey west, she would not have named the honey, or the association, or the thief she brought down, or the farm she saved. She would have named the ordinary things, because she had come to understand, as the best of them do, that the ordinary was the whole of it, the long marriage and the noisy children and the mended shawl and the 10,000 small daily decisions to keep going, to be honest, to save the living thing in front of you, that these and not the one dramatic winter were the true accounting of a life well spent. She had come off a freight wagon with nothing, into a town that pitied her and a marriage that expected nothing of her, and a country that had already buried her husband's bees. And by the time she was done, she had made all of it live. Out in the willow draw, the summer after they buried her, the clover came in heavy, the way it always did, and the bees went out to it at dawn and came home gold at dusk, and the work she had begun on her knees in a norther went on without her, which is the only kind of legacy that was ever worth the leaving.